that we have our guest here, Professor John Lee from City University of Hong Kong, to deliver a paper, a talk on a tree bank of Buddhist Chinese texts and the application of it. It's a joint paper with Tak-Sum Wong from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, while Professor John Lee is from the City University of Hong Kong. And I would like to ask Pavel Straniak to introduce our guest.
Thank you. Well, my introduction will be very simple. I think that for us, it would be quite interesting to look at slightly different tree banking than we usually do, because most of our tree banking so far has been with contemporary text, mostly news text, and most of our, at least at our department, most of our papers have been around tree banking, have been concerned with strictly the linguistic annotation side of the problem. But I think it's interesting to look slightly further, kind of a slightly broader look at the tree banking of different kinds of text, whether that be learner corpora or historical corpora, and maybe see some of the applications of that linguistic annotation to some other tasks of better understanding such texts. And hopefully today we'll see an interesting example of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And it's my privilege to have the chance here to talk to you and share a little bit about a tree bank of Buddhist Chinese texts that my colleague and I have developed. This is joint work with Tak-Sum Wong, my former PhD student, now a postdoc at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And I'm a faculty member at City University of Hong Kong. As was just mentioned, tree banks are increasingly used in other areas of study, including the study of classics and philology. There are many tree banks developed already for this purpose. For example, the ancient Greek and Latin tree bank from the Perseus Project. There's also a medieval Latin tree bank of the works of Thomas Aquinas, and among many others that I don't have the space here to list. And today I'd like to introduce you to a small-scale tree bank of Buddhist Chinese texts with a focus on a number of applications that we have explored using this tree bank. I'll first say a few words about the content and annotation of this tree bank, and then we'll look at several applications. The text in this tree bank is based on a Korean edition of the Chinese Buddhist Canon. So just like there is a canon for the Bible with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, there's also a canon, a collection of texts that are considered canonical or important for the Buddhist community. And these are, the tree bank that we have developed is based on Chinese text, but it's a version that has been preserved in Korea. So hence the Korean edition of the Chinese Buddhist Canon. And the name is a Tripitaka Koreana. The digital version of this came from my collaborator, Louis Lancaster, Professor Lancaster at Berkeley. And he has graciously shared his digital text with me. Originally, the text was preserved in a temple in Korea, a picture of which you can see on the right corner here. and quite very carefully preserved over the centuries, and considered by some scholars to be even more faithful to the original than versions elsewhere, including in Japan and in China. It is, to my understanding, the largest digitized corpus of medieval Chinese texts. There are about 50 million characters in over 1,500 texts. Most of them are not original, though. Most of them are translations from Indic language. So Buddhism spread from India to China, and as part of the spreading, the missionary translated the original text in various Indic languages into Chinese. The translation took place over a millennium, about 1,000 years, and so one of the applications that I will share with you is a study on how medieval Chinese changed throughout this 1,000 years. So the translation style changed as the language itself changed. So it's not just a large collection, but also time-stamped with the date of translation, so it can be useful for looking at language evolution. Our tree bank is manual, and it contains manually annotated text from 4 sutras. There is the Diamond Sutra with Kumarajiva's translation. The K number is the code used for the Tripitaka Koreana edition. And Nagasena Bhiksu Sutra, selections from the Suragama Sutra, and selections from the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. So these represent different periods of the translation history, and so we hope to represent somewhat the variety of language that is found in the canon. And altogether, the selections from these sutras contain a total of 50,000 characters. It is medieval Chinese, and we decided to base our annotation on the Penn Chinese Treebank in terms of the part-of-speech text set. Because the Penn Chinese Treebank was designed for modern Chinese, so it didn't always fit perfectly for medieval Chinese, but we did our best to map the part-of-speech categories that we found in medieval Chinese to this text set. And we follow the Stanford Dependencies for Chinese. There's the same problem with the fact that these dependencies were designed for modern Chinese, and so there can always be difficulties imposing it on medieval Chinese. We mostly follow their definitions, but with a number of additional relations that we added to fit what we found in our corpus. And the details can be found in the article that we wrote for the Treebank in digital humanities, scholarship in digital humanities. And I don't need to explain dependency Treebank in front of this audience. So here is a sample parse tree for the sentence Ananda bowed to Buddha and said, and so on. And so you can see it's the usual part-of-speech tagging and dependency relations. Okay, so I'm going to share two areas of applications. The first one I label character profiling, understood in a broad way. And these will include conversational network. So studying in this large corpus, which character spoke to which character. Character hierarchy. There is our hypothesis is that there is a hierarchy of characters. Some are considered more important or superior. I'm not sure what is the right word here, than others. And we try to detect it by analyzing the verbs that are used to report direct speech between them. So more details in a minute. And then we also use the tree bank for mining character-verb associations. Which verbs are most associated with which character, and then the same with various locations, toponyms in the Buddhist text. So that is the first area of application. The second area that we'll look at is two writing styles, the literary versus the vernacular style. The general understanding is that classical Chinese literature has been evolving from the literary style to a more vernacular style. And we studied with a number of linguistic constructions and see if we can see this trend reflected in the translation of Buddhist texts, which took place over 1,000 years. So these are the two applications that I will be sharing with you. Okay, so first, character profiling. There's a large number of characters in the canon. You've heard of the Buddha. There are also bodhisattvas, various deities, disciples of Buddha, monks, lay Buddhists, and kings, and so on. I should say here that I'm not an expert in Buddhism myself, so I'm speaking here with some humility. And if there are some in the audience who are researchers in this area, then I would very much welcome your corrections. So the applications in character profiling that we'll look at will include who speaks to whom in the form of a conversational network, and then who did what and where in terms of character verb associations and character toponym associations, and also can we classify the characters into a hierarchy using word choice. Okay, so to do this analysis, the first thing that we did was to parse the entire canon, which has over 50 million characters, by training an automatic parser on the manually annotated portion of the tree bank, the one that has 50,000 characters. It's a bit outdated now, so these days we have much higher performing machine learning framework for training parsers. But what we did at the time was you train a CRF model for word segmentation, also the CRF++ model for part of speech tagging, and we use the MST parser then to train out our dependency parser. The performance wasn't bad in our evaluation. So there is over 97% accuracy in word segmentation and respectable part of speech tagging rates, I think, over 80%. But dependency labeling not perhaps as high as what we wish. So only 61% UAS and 51% LAS. Okay, so what I will share now, first will be conversational networks. So one way to analyze literary text is to look at the direct speech that is reported in a text. We're not the first person or the first group to do this. There has been analysis on various novels, and they would draw a graph with the notes representing characters in the novel, whatever the text happens to be. And an edge between two nodes would indicate that these two people have spoken to each other. Most research would only count direct speech, but I think there's also works that would also try to take into account indirect speech. So that is our goal. So we hope to draw a similar conversational network on the characters that we can find in the entire Chinese Buddhist canon. Here's an example of a conversational network from a novel. This is, sorry, I didn't put the reference here, but it's from Elson et al. They analyze English novels, and here is the network from Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. So the notes represent characters in that novel. The larger the note is, the more that character spoke. The edges also have different widths. So some edges are thicker than others, and that means that there's more conversation, more instances of direct speech between the two characters. So this is one way to quickly grasp the most important characters in the text, and who are the most important ones, and are there any communities, and sometimes it can also indicate the plot. Here is another example taken from Hamlet, and it comes from Moretti at Stanford University. And he has used it to analyze the plots in various Shakespearean plays. And so here is the one from Hamlet. The construction of these networks are a little easier with plays because the speech is clearly identified in the text, but a bit more challenging for novels, right? Because there's no structured annotation on who is the speaker and who is the listener and so on. And for us, we have the same challenge with the Chinese Buddhist text, and we have to extract the utterances, direct speech, and also attribute each utterance to a speaker and to a listener. So we first retrieve the utterances by locating all the quotation marks. That's the Chinese quotation marks. So it's unambiguous, so that part is easy. Then we identify the quotative verb or the saying verb. So he shouted to her. Shouts would be the quotative verb, or he said to her to say, he told her, and so on and so forth. This is not strictly necessary, but we'll be using this, the choice of this verb in the character hierarchy analysis. So that's why I mentioned it here. And then attributes the utterance to speakers and listeners. It's not always easy because, as is the same for any language, the author doesn't always explicitly indicate who is the speaker and who is the listener. Sometimes you can have a dialogue chain where maybe the speakers and listener would be indicated in the first exchange, but then after that is all implicit. So we have implemented some simple algorithms to directly, automatically infer speakers and listeners when there is a dialogue chain. Here's one example. So at that time, his father, the king, asked the attendants, the prince went on an outing, is he happy? He replied, he is not. The king then asked why, and then the attendant, he replied, on the road, he met an old man. It is for this reason that he is unhappy. So our task then is to identify the three direct speech here, right, as put in the rightmost column. Then for each utterance, identify the speaker and the listener. So the first one, the king asked the attendants, that's straightforward. And then the second and the third will be part of the dialogue chain, and the identity of the speaker and listener would need to be inferred. There's of course also errors in this through this automatic process. Okay, so a bit of detail on how we identify speakers and listeners. So we prioritize precision over recall, and so we tend to be conservative. And so we, in front of an utterance, we try to locate a qualitative verb or a saying verb. So in this case, it's the word to address. And then we identify the speaker and listener by looking at the dependency relations and looking at what is the noun subject of that verb. Sometimes the noun subject may not be immediately before the qualitative verb. Here, for example, there's actually a series of two verbs here. Ananda, a disciple of Buddha, prostrated, and then addressed Buddha. So we in Stanford Dependencies, it's these structures are used with the DEP relation, and so we trace the DEP with the DEP back to the main verb and then the noun subject. And the listener is taken to be the indirect object of the qualitative verb or saying verb, and sometimes it can also be some distance away. So we do recognize that this doesn't catch all the instances, not even to say pronouns and so on, but our priority has been on the precision of the retrieved speaker and listener. Okay, so using this algorithm, we extracted 506,000 utterances from Chinese Buddhist Canon, and each one with their speaker and listeners. Sometimes not both are known, so it can be missing for some of them. And here is a first look at the retrieved patterns here. The 10 most frequent speakers. So this can be a quick way to look at who are the main characters in the text. So Buddha, as you might expect, is the most frequent speakers, and followed by monks. So it's a generic term for various monks, and then Subhuti, Ananda, etc. So some of these are followers of disciples of Buddha. Others are deities, and there's also a category called the Bodhisattvas. And I'll say more about these in the character hierarchy analysis. We can also look at to whom a character speak most. So kind of like his social network. So for Buddha, for example, he spoke most to various monks. and then to Ananda, Subhuti, his disciples, and then Saripatra, Manjuri, these are bodhisattvas. And you can also ask to whom did he listen to most? So it's similar here with the same top five characters as the speakers. Okay, and then we generated the conversational network as a graph. And here is a picture of the graph that includes only the edges with over 400 utterances. So the entire, the complete graph will be quite unwieldy, and so only the showing here only the arrows and the notes that with an underlying number of utterances over 400. So several example questions that you can ask of this graph. For example, you can ask among the disciples of Buddha, who might be the closest one, right? As measured by how frequently they have conversations. In our results here, then Buddha spoke most to Ananda, Subhuti, and Sariputra. And I believe this would reflect what a Buddhism scholar would expect. If any of you have knowledge about this, I'd be happy to learn more about this. So this provides a kind of a quantitative angle towards the relationship between Buddha and his various followers. It also confirms Buddha as the central characters, contributing 44% of all utterances that we're able to extract from the Buddhist canon. And but in terms of the number of utterances to the character that received the most number of utterances is the monks. So this is a collective term that includes many monks. So that is the one with the most conversation. But in terms of characters with personal names, then it's the disciples that I have mentioned. You can also look at other characters and other, I suppose plot is not the right word here, but communities in the Buddhist canon. So one question we ask is, well, given the centrality of Buddha, is there any character to whom he never spoke, or at least no direct speech was reported or retrieved by our algorithm? So we found that there are some characters who fall into this category. There's a son of heaven who spoke mostly to Manjusri, Bodhisattva, but not to Buddha. And then there's Nagasena, a monk, and King Milinda, and they're also not connected to the Buddha. So I think these are observations that would be worth further exploration to find out whether what might be the reasons behind this. Is it just the maybe is a geographical reason that they never met Buddha in person, or perhaps there are other reasons. A second question that we ask is concerned with different schools of Buddhism that are represented in this one canon. So it's widely recognized that some of the text in the canon represents one school within Buddhism that's called Mahayana, and the other represents or reflect more the doctrines of another school called Hinayana. And the text in the canon can be classified into these two schools of Buddhism. I think there are others too, not just these two. And so what we did was we generated the conversational sub-network for only the text in Mahayana, and also did the same for only the text on Hinayana, and see how whether the characters or the shape of the graph would be different. The main differences we found was the following. Number one, the bodhisattvas were a lot more prominent in Mahayana. So if we look at the top 5 of these in Mahayana, one of the schools of Buddhism, then they contributed more than 11% of the utterances. But the same figure in the Hinayana portion of the text will be only 0.03. So they were given a lot more emphasis in one school than the other. Okay, so this is the Mahayana network, and the characters who are bodhisattvas are put in rectangles. So there are quite a few of these, even when we just show the most prominent characters. In Hinayana, there are less mention of these of this class of characters, and in contrast, the monks were more prominent. So the monks contributed 21.9% of the utterances in Hinayana versus only 1.4% of the utterances in Mahayana. And again, I have to speak with caution here, given my lack of expertise in Buddhism, but I do believe it might be consistent with the traditional characterization among Buddhism studies, where Hinayana is seen as a monastic religion. So the monk seems to be given more emphasis there, at least in terms of direct speeches that involve them. Okay, and here is the conversational network for just the Hinayana portion, with the monks having a thicker line edge with Buddha than Mahayana. Okay, so let me now go on to a second application on character hierarchy. Well, there's a large number of different kinds of characters in the canon, and our goal here is to infer whether there's some kind of hierarchy among them based on their verbal interactions, and more precisely how these interactions are reported in terms of the saying verbs or quotative verbs. And we first look at how Buddha's direct speech is reported when he is the speaker. So when he speaks, he seems to prefer the verb to tell, or gao, G-A-O. And one thing we notice is that he never used one of the quotative verbs that is nonetheless very common if we take all the utterances into account, and that is to address, or by, B-A-I. And so there seems to be, it seems that this is not random, and that there can be some, the choice of this verb might indicate relative status between the speaker and listener. So we also look at the utterances when Buddha is the listener. So the pattern is almost flipped. So when other characters speak to Buddha, they use the verb to address, and they are rarely reported with the verb to tell, gao, which Buddha used when he is speaking. Okay, so we therefore try to rank the characters with their usage patterns of to address versus to tell. And so our hypothesis here is that they indicate relative status. So over 95% of the character pairs use by in only one direction. So that is promising, right? So it's typically one would be more senior or more important than the other. And so one would address the other person, but not the other way around. And on the flip side, 87% of the character pairs use to tell or gao only in one direction. Okay, so for the same reason. So therefore we use these two verbs to rank the characters, and you rank higher than another one if you are always addressing them. Sorry, if you're always telling them, and you rank lower if you have to address the other person. Okay, and we use a database of personal names from Damadrum Buddhist College in Taiwan for our work. And so here's a summary of the hierarchy. It's not as clean as what might be suggested here, but this is what the general trend is. So there's Buddha at the top, so everyone else is addressing him, and he's telling everyone else. And then is the Bodhisattvas, and then the Buddha's disciples, and then the deities, maybe somewhat surprisingly, at least for laymen like myself, and then the kings, and then the monks. So a few words about these terms, which I know is not familiar to most people. So Bodhisattvas are enlightened beings, and they're considered closest to Buddhahood among everyone. And so it's in terms of the verb choice in speech reporting, they seem to be superior to everyone else. So all the 60 gao or by utterances with the disciples between both these enlightened beings and the disciples imply that these enlightened beings are more senior or more or superior to the disciples. And the disciples of Buddha are inferior to the bodhisattvas, but superior to monks and nuns, for the lack of a better term, again, according to analysis of to address versus to tell. And then finally, the deities are not at the top of the hierarchy, as a layman might think. And most of the utterances would imply that they are considered at a lower rank than the enlightened beings, the bodhisattvas. Okay, and then the kings are then even considered lower in status, even to the disciples of Buddha. All right, so this is a second application on hierarchy of character. Now I'd like to move on to associations between characters with the verbs and with toponyms. Okay, so it's again, this is a task that has been applied on other domains like news, right? Discovering who are the entities and who are the people, what do they do, and locations and so on in information extraction, for example. And we're hoping to apply the same kind of questions on the Buddhist canon. So again, we use pretty simple strategy here to hope to achieve relatively high precision. So we retrieve character verb pairs, again, by dependency relation with nominal subject. And like before, we detect serial verb constructions using tree patterns with the DEP relation. And we did find that using dependencies did help in the accuracy, despite our relatively small manually annotated tree bank over just using part of speech based and in a baseline of just co-occurrence in the sentence. Here are some character verb associations that we're able to mine. There is Buddha, whose most frequent action as depicted by verbs in the canon was to speak. Perhaps it's not unexpected because after all, the canon is supposed to preserve his teachings, and at that time it's often verbal. And there is also the verb at or to dwell. This is also frequent because many of the canonical texts are very diligent in reporting where he was when delivering the particular discourse or sutra. So that is also very common. Ananda, one of the disciples, most common action is to address the Buddha, and then also a generic verb for speaking, to speak. There is also a Buddha called Pratika Buddha, and he's seen to be more abstract, and that seems to be reflected in the verb as well. So he's the most common one is to not have, and to attain, typically followed by to attain enlightenment. Then there is the example of the character Mahayana Deva, and he was a translator, and so that is reflected in the most frequent verb choices. So he is often mentioned in the text as having translated this text from the original Indic languages and serving the emperor in doing so. So these are the two main verbs associated with this translator. Okay, and then I'll quickly look at the toponyms as well. So we follow also a simple strategy according to tree pattern to identify locations associated with a character. We identify toponyms from the same database that I mentioned from Taiwan, and we look at location markers. It's a manually constructed list of these location markers here. Sorry, there's no gloss here, but it's the second last word is the character for to dwell or at, and then we take the direct object of these location markers as the toponym. Okay, and in this case, we find that dependency didn't help, and perhaps partially attributable to our small training sets, which led to not very accurate parsing at times, and also the toponym usage may not the location may not be mentioned in the same sentence. It can be several sentences apart from the character name to the character mentioned. So that's also a limitation that that we have. And here are the top locations associated with Buddha. So there are mainly two regions here. Sravasti is the place where he gave many discourses during 25 seasons. That's the place where he would stay during a rainy season to teach. And when he does that, often staying at a monastery called Jetavana. So that's also one of the top locations. And another region, Rajagara, and there's a place called the Bamboo Grove, where he is known to stay often, and a peak, Vulture's Peak, where he is known to have delivered one of the more important sutras. Okay. Is it okay to speak for another 5 or 10 minutes or so. I think the time, is okay. All right. Okay, so so let me now turn to another area of application, which is going to be language change. And in particular, I'll be describing the literary versus vernacular style writing in style of writing in Chinese. So before 1920, the most privileged form of writing in China is the literary style. So I don't know what would be an equivalent European equivalent, but I suppose it might be similar to the way that it used to be always Latin. That's the privileged language, and in the case of China, you would always use a literary style before 1920 if you want to be taken seriously, if you're writing something serious and formal. But at the same time, there is a vernacular style that is the colloquial language that people actually spoke. And so people would write in a style that is closer to the vernacular style when writing in popular literature, popular novels, but also religious texts. And the reason, at least for the Buddhist text, is that they want to present teachings in a more easily accessible language. I believe it might be a similar situation with the translation of the Bible in vernacular languages. And again, the underlying motivation is so that ordinary people, it can reach ordinary people more easily. And it's a similar reason for the Buddhist text that have more, typically more vernacular style than other genres. So the conventional wisdom is that as time went on, there is a movement towards more vernacular elements. Maybe it would still be overall literary, right? It is the most important form up to 1920, but there's more vernacular elements as time went on. And we wanted to confirm and quantify this conventional wisdom in this study. And we also want to look at whether one phenomenon in a dynasty, it's called a Northern Song dynasty, whether that has any effects. So what I'm thinking of is a period in Chinese history in the Northern Song dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1127. There was a lot of official and state support for Buddhist translation. And in particular, they actually appointed, so these are civil servants, I suppose I can say, they're called stylists, to polish the Buddhist translations. One of their job description is to ensure that the translation conforms to the court ideology. No mentioning of the emperor's name, for example. They also were in charge to insert words to smooth out the text, and perhaps most pertinent to our study was that they were tasked to replace vulgar or vernacular elements in a translation with more formally written classical language. We looked at 3 linguistic constructions, and the first one that we looked at was classifier. In the vernacular style, a classifier is required, same as in modern Chinese, for most nouns. So you would not say one flower, you would have to say one piece of flour. So suppose similar to one cup of coffee, or I think you get the idea. So so in a vernacular style, there would be either a number followed by like one, followed by classifier, like piece, and followed by a noun, like flower. Or it can also be noun number classifier, so flower, one piece. In the literary style, no classifier is expected, just one flower. So here is the data that we have computed. So these are the percentage of nouns that either have a classifier or no classifier. So the blue portion represents the percentage, the portion that has no classifier. And as you can see, it's pretty high. So the literary style is quite dominant. So approaching only 7% in the Han Qing dynasty, the earliest period in our corpus. Almost the same as we went in the second historical period, the Eastern Qin, but there's a drop in the Sui Tang period. So perhaps a suggestion that the vernacular style is catching on in terms of classifier. But in the Northern Song dynasty, where we have these style lists, there seems to be fewer classifiers again, possibly taken out by these style lists so that the text would sound more classical. A second linguistic construction we looked at was proximal demonstrative, so this as opposed to that. So the literary style, there are several possibilities here, shi and si and si. So this speech, for example, would be uses one of these three choices followed by the noun. As in a vernacular style, it would be mostly si. So with the other two less frequently used. So again, we looked at how often each of these three choices are attested in our corpus, and we find a similar pattern in the diachronically. So with the literary style declining from the earliest period up to the Sui Tang, the third column, and then shot up again in the Northern Song. So again, can be the result of a style list. The next graph is also on the same linguistic construction, but first one looking at the post-prepositional ones, and this graph here with very similar trends, looking at demonstratives following a verb rather than a preposition. Okay, and then lastly, we look at use of copula in nominal sentences, and to avoid parsing errors is a bit tricky because the copula in Chinese is ambiguous. So we looked at nominal sentences only with grammaticalized adverbs, which are less ambiguous, which lets us unambiguously identify which are nominal sentences and which are not. The literary style requires no copula, so you can just say the present emptiness. Yeah, so to express the idea of the present is just empty. So you just put two nouns side by side, and as I said, we focus on nominal sentences that have that have an adverb between these two nouns. So the example given here is just, and there's several others, negation and another adverb, because these lets us unambiguously determine that these are indeed nominal sentences. Otherwise, there will be there can be lots of false positives. In contrast, the vernacular style requires a copula. So we take the same adverbs, but now they would be followed by the copula shi, shi. So Form is emptiness. That is one of the more famous sayings. So it would not have just G, just, but have a sh, SHI following it. Okay, and here are the trends in terms of using negation, nominal sentences. Again, we see a upward trend as we get to the Northern Song Dynasty, although in this case, it has been going up already since the Han Qing. So maybe there's some uncertainty whether it is just the effects of the stylists. And in terms of the grammaticalized adverbs, then this is more closer to what we saw before with a movement towards the vernacular style, but then a reversion to a more classical literary style when we get to Northern Song. Okay, so I will conclude now. I have presented a tree bank of Chinese Buddhist texts. I joined work with my former students, Wong Tak Sum, and I have taken the chance to describe a few applications based on this tree bank, an analysis of the conversational networks of various characters, detection of a hierarchy among the characters in the corpus, character associations with verbs and places, the most important the most common frequent actions of Buddha and places that he was reported to have been, for example, and also language change in medieval Chinese in terms of classifiers, demonstratives, and the use of the copula. Okay, so thank you again for letting me have this chance to speak to you, and my contact information is here in case you wish to contact me again in the future. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we have seen several interesting applications